Faith Church, hope you're doing well. This Sunday, we are going to talk together about grace. The book of Jonah is taking us all kinds of places this summer. And this Sunday, as we look at chapter 2, the whole chapter actually, we're making some progress here. It's going to take us to the idea, the reality of grace. And I'm going to suggest, and I believe that Jonah's main problem in his life is he doesn't understand grace, much less experience grace. And as the more I thought about that this week, I think it's probably the main human problem in life is that we just don't understand the grace of God. And without understanding it, we probably never have experienced it. In my study this week, I was reminded of some things that Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote in probably his most famous book called The Cost of Discipleship. And don't have time Sunday to weave this in, so I thought I'd include it in today's House to House. And probably his most famous section in this book, if you've ever read it, it's well worth reading. Little dense to get through at points, but he kind of goes through Jesus' teaching on discipleship through the Sermon on the Mount. It's a timeless work, but his probably most famous sections where he talks about grace and he contrasts the difference between what he calls cheap grace on one hand and costly grace on the other hand. And he says that cheap grace is the deadly enemy of the church. That's how he begins that section. Cheap grace is the deadly enemy of the church. And he goes on to say that cheap grace is something that it's a doctrine that you believe in your mind, but it doesn't really transform your life. It's limited to your theology, not into your day-to-day living. He says that cheap grace is about justifying the sin. It's forgiving our sin, but not changing or justifying the sinner. Again, it's just an idea in our minds, but it never really sinks into our hearts and lives. And I love this one section. I'll read it to you, 2 paragraphs, and it's you may have heard this before. It's well known, but he defines first cheap grace and then costly grace. He says, cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. In other words, you're forgiven, you can just stay as you are. That's cheap grace. He says it's baptism without church discipline. You're welcome, but just stay as you are. We don't require you to change. It's communion without confession. It's absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship. Like Jesus welcomes me into his family, but doesn't really require me to follow him and to become like him. Cheap grace is grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate. Costly grace, on the other hand, he says, is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It's obviously referring to Jesus' parable about the man who discovers this treasure in a field and is so valuable, he was willing to give up everything he has to obtain this treasure. He says it's the pearl of great price to buy, which the merchant will sell with all his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out the eye which causes him to stumble. It is the call of Jesus at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. And one of the things that the story of Jonah is teaching us is that Jonah is a good example of somebody who doesn't really understand, much less he hasn't experienced the true reality of the grace of God. Because if he had, he'd be a different person. And it's going to give us an opportunity this Sunday to really think deeply, carefully together about what that grace is and how we might be changed. So hoping you will be able to be with us and explore this together. I encourage you to read through Jonah, at least chapter 2. It's probably a good thing to read through the whole thing again, but read through chapter 2 and Jonah's prayer there that he prays in the belly of the fish. And that's where we will begin our conversation. So looking forward to being with you wherever you are today. I pray that you would sense the love of God your Father, the grace of Christ his Son, and the presence of the Spirit with you. Peace.